amongst all the CXOs, I think, and this is probably going to sound a bit arrogant, the one person who has an end to end view of the organization is the CFO. And here I can sort of go out on a limb and say even the CEO is not as well informed because the CFO has an end to end view from the time a raw material gets into the factory till the time it gets out, and the velocity at which you handle that conversion of it into a saleable good. And at the end of the day, it is all about the numbers. And again, the numbers are handled by the CFO.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Hey everybody, what follows from here is a conversation that I had with Ganapathy Subramaniam, the CFO of TerraPay. This is a deep dive on the payments ecosystem. We talk about why moving money across borders has traditionally just been so difficult, like the banks not talk to each other. We talk about the key trends shaping the cross-border payment space in the next 5 years, and some insights into TerraPay's business model, specifically how you monetize a payment infrastructure at scale. We also touch on FX margins, that's the old currency, and how to ensure transparency and trust with customers when you're moving their money. GS, as I call him, he characterizes the CFO as the Chief Value Creation Officer, which is a new one here. And I love this analogy. I think a lot of you are going to steal it. And finally, we get into the qualities that separate the good versus great CFOs. All this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. Bull market, bear market. Rates will rise, rates will fall. Can someone please just invent a crystal ball already? Until then, over 40,000 businesses have future-proofed their companies with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. Whether you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If you listen to this podcast, you'll know I ask CFOs all the time to rep their tech stacks, and I would say almost every one of them use NetSuite. And that's what I would use too. Whether you're a company earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/metrics. The guide is free to you. That is netsuite.com/metrics. Ooh, yeah, it's netsuite.com/metrics. Please, guys, I really need this. Being an operator is not for the faint of heart. It often feels like you're jumping out of an airplane and building the parachute on your way down. CEOs, CFOs, COOs, and BizOps leaders feel my pain. That's why I joined Operators Guild. It's home to more than 1,000 of the most elite, high-growth operators in the world. Think the Special Forces for business scale. Members have access to over 150 in-person events across all 25 global chapters. The modern startup founder, CFO, and COO are really just multidisciplinary problem solvers, which is why having the best problem solvers together has created the ultimate diversity intelligence of any operator group in the world. Operators Guild gave me the chance to meet my own personal board of directors, people I can bounce ideas off of, and their online forum allows you to get answers from your peers as questions pop up. Like, how do I run an employee secondary? Or what should I pay as a base commission rate on SaaS deals? I've made great friends through attending their highly acclaimed OG Summit, and frequently attend their online masterclasses taught by the best tech operators in the business. Join Operators Guild and access the Navy SEALs of high-growth business scaling, a group built by operators for operators. Learn more and apply at operators-guild.com. That's operators-guild.com, and tell them CJ sent you. They'll hook you up. GS, I'm so privileged to have you here on the podcast. We got CJ and GS, and this is truly a global recording here. You're my first guest ever calling in from Dubai, so welcome to the show.
Delighted.
I want to ask something maybe stupid up front, and that's why is moving money across borders traditionally so difficult? Why is that a hard task?
So the traditional pipeline was obviously the banks, right? And the banks rely upon the SWIFT network to transfer money across geographies. And the entire network is interceded by correspondent banks. And the way the tariff structures were devised was to cater to large value transactions. It was not designed for small value transactions. And the transaction fees that the correspondent banking system charges are enormous, not suited to small ticket transactions. So it's the transaction fee that really kills the deal. So, what used to happen was if you used a bank to transfer money, you incurred significant costs unless you are transferring $100,000. So, the transaction fee is a fixed fee, but as a proportion of the amount that you're transferring, it can either be enormous or it can be a minuscule amount. The second problem is I believe this is, I mean, from coming from the money transfer business, I believe that there was lack of transparency in the way that banks were charging for Forex, and it was episodic in its character. So if it's a large corporate negotiating a transaction with a bank, you can pay a few bips over the spread. But if it's an individual negotiating that, he doesn't have any negotiating room with the banks. So the banks used to take advantage of that, and therefore that was the second problem. The third problem is banks don't do instant settlement. And if it's a small ticket transaction, you can just imagine, CJ, you're sending, I don't know if you're from America, so probably
Yeah.
doesn't really apply to you. But let us say I'm an Indian traveling in the United States, and there's an emergency back home, and I need to send money back home. I don't have to send a whole lot of money. I probably have to send, say, $500, $600 to meet that emergency. I would pay an arm and a leg to get that money to India. One. Second is, after paying an arm and leg, it will still reach India after a day or two. And this is one of the more efficient corridors. If it's Africa, it can take 3 to 4 to 5 days. By the time the emergency is over, and probably the person who wanted that money is dead and gone. So this is exactly the problem that the cross-border money transfer industry is trying to solve. So there is a bit of an impact that this industry can make. In fact, if you look at our investor profile, there is at least one impact investor in that. Basically, to reduce the cost at which these transactions can be accomplished. Historically, these were as high as 8 to 9%. So for every
Wow.
$100, I pay, say, $8 or $9 as costs, which is an untenable situation. So this was a collective decision by the United Nations, for example, to set itself its decadal goals. One of the goals was to reduce the cost of these transactions. So the target set was 3% to be reached by the end of this decade. We are still at about 5 to 6% in whenever the money is going to continents like Africa. And it's not instant. I mean, when it's an emergency, it's just not instant, and it's not useful by the time it arrives. So that is how these new rails came into being, and they are thriving at this point of time. And along the way, the pandemic happened, and people were quite comfortable doing digital transactions. So for a bank transaction, in many countries you still had to go to the bank, fill out a couple of forms, and all sorts of stuff, right? I suspect you still have to do a lot of that stuff even in the United States. So it was all bypassed because it became digital at the initiation of the transaction. At the terminal end of the transaction, depending on the country and the sophistication of the financial systems in those countries, it could either be terminated digitally, or in many countries in Africa, it was still a cash transaction. It was delivered by, you go to the nearby merchant and cash out that transaction by way of a cash drawal. All this has now changed, probably one, partly due to the pandemic and partly due to the sophistication that is creeping into the space, that it is now being originated either by cash or digitally and terminated digitally. More and more of it. So if you take the total size of the cross-border P2P money transfer market, you're talking probably of 700, $800 billion a year, depending on whom you speak to. Definitely, the World Bank estimates that that is where the number ranges. And at least 25 to 30% is starting to get terminated digitally. And that's a growing proportion of the total universe. And that is, in fact, the market that companies like TerraPay address.
Got it.
We are not a P2P company. B2B company in the sense that we provide the rails to money transfer operators like Western Union, MoneyGram, and all these guys. Wherever they are not able to reach, we are able to take the money and deliver it. So that's broadly the thesis.
GS, what strikes me is those three pillars, cost, transparency, and speed, they all impact the people at the bottom end of the spectrum the most, probably the people who are least likely to be able to pay it or need it the most. In a way, the system feels like it was set up to be almost predatory against people who needed it the most at first.
Absolutely. It is opaque and predatory.
And the difference between B2B and peer-to-peer, can you elaborate on that? Is peer-to-peer me like on Venmo sending my buddy $10 because he bought pizza for us, and B2B is like transfers between business bank accounts?
So when I say P2P, it was person to person, actually.
Okay.
So a person in the northern hemisphere sending money to his relation or relative in the southern hemisphere. This is broadly the broad flow, right? It is northern hemisphere, which is more affluent countries where people, migrant workers, go to work and earn a living, sending money back home. So that is the market that it starts to address. When I say we are a B2B player, we don't really reach the customer directly. The customer doesn't belong to us. They belong to a Western Union or a MoneyGram.
Got it. Okay. So you're the rails in between those.
I'm just the rails in between. I'm like a wholesale provider of the technology platform. I also provide the liquidity to them to settle instantaneously. I do provide the rates, of course, hopefully competitive rates. I don't really control the price at which they price it to their customers. However, this is such a competitive market, the prices will keep going down because when the costs at which I'm providing these services go down, it eventually translates into a benefit in pricing and the pricing goes down to the end consumer. Now, this is a very slow process. We're still seeing 5 to 6%. Even when I joined this company 4 years back, already I'm saying that Africa is starting to see rates go down. India has already seen rates go down to next to nothing. So when the costs go down, it eventually gets passed on because of the competition in the market.
Got it. And before we hopped on the pod, you were talking about the quote unquote wallet share of different regions in the world. Would you mind just speaking to which regions out there are most attractive? I think you'd mentioned Africa is a huge boon for money transfers right now, which I actually didn't know.
So Africa is not huge in terms of transaction value, but in terms of the yield that I get on that business, it is much bigger because the banking systems are not uniform and efficient. It takes a lot more time to fulfill transactions in that market. Therefore, there is a price to be paid. We can reduce that price that you pay for the inefficiency of that market by providing for instant settlement. The second thing that happens is Africa is a big wallet market, right? So we settle directly into bank accounts, but we started life as settling directly into wallets. So, and Africa has probably more wallets than they have bank accounts. And therefore, we became a very, very efficient way of delivering into those wallets directly. That is why Africa is very attractive. In terms of sheer size, I think South Asia still dominates. Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh would be the dominant markets. But they are so competitive. Everybody wants to be in these countries. Therefore, the yields in these markets are very, very wafer thin. What you lose in yield, you make up in terms of the size of the market itself. Southeast Asia is good. I wouldn't say it is as bad as India as a South Asia market in terms of yields. But it is, for example, Vietnamese workers going to Korea and sending money back home. That's a huge thing. Again, workers going to Japan, sending money back home. So these are all huge corridors. Workers going into Australia and sending back money. So those are all the corridors that are super attractive. And Latin America, you're probably already familiar with. There is a lot of Latin America workers going to Europe and to the United States and Canada. So that is another flow that is very attractive.
I think what's interesting for anybody out there who's looking to optimize their business model is how you're identifying that you're meeting customers where they want to transact and how they want to transact, and identifying these corridors. I think corridor, that word is just sticking with me because you're identifying from one node in the network to the next. And like I knew about, say, like the corridor between the US and Mexico for people sending money home, but you just identified about 5 others that I didn't know were hyperactive.
Yeah, I just have the math here. So, just active corridors alone, we serve about 3,800 corridors. So there are that many corridors. The rationale for the existence of a company like TerraPay is all that, and more importantly, a single integration with TerraPay, and you're able to reach 144 countries. And
Wow.
in each of those countries, a multiplicity of delivery mechanisms. It can be via banks, via aggregators, or via wallets. It is basically introducing simplicity to the large money transfer operators. Of course, when the markets become very, very large, the delivery side of the market, some of the money transfer operators prefer to go on their own. So there are instances where the large players would prefer to go into that market themselves, because instead of paying me that price, they can reach into that market directly. The cost at which we are able to do it is fairly fine, and therefore they stick with it. And they don't have to build a whole lot of infrastructure to address that integration and that sort of stuff.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Annual planning season is upon us. That's right, my favorite time of year. And it's not just about setting goals for the coming year, it's about ensuring you have the right tools in place to measure and achieve those goals. As a SaaS CFO, I know having access to reliable, real-time metrics is crucial for my annual planning process. That's why I'm so excited to partner with today's sponsor, Maxio. Maxio is a billing and financial operations platform that helps subscription businesses reconcile bookings, billings, GAAP revenue, and SaaS metrics automatically. By the way, guys, bookings, billings, GAAP revenue, not the same thing. Got to get them straight. Because these numbers are the foundation of your financial models, it's important to have quick access and trust that they are correct. Don't let the complexities of SaaS finance and accounting slow you down. If you want to start 2025 with the right tools, check out Maxio by visiting maxio.com/run the numbers. That's maxio.com/run the numbers. Request a demo through our link to support the podcast, ya boy, and receive a 10% discount on your first year with Maxio. That's maxio.com/run the numbers. maxio.com/run the numbers. Please, guys, I really need this. Okay, serious question for all my accounting pros here today. Are you doing what you were hired to do? What I mean is, do you have time to actually be a business partner, or are you buried in tedious manual tasks just to get your journal entries prepared every month? I know how that feels. Leapfin's here to help with that. Leapfin is accounting automation software that automatically prepares and posts reliable journal entries. And that's just the beginning. High-growth businesses like Reddit, Canva, and SeatGeek choose Leapfin to eliminate manual tasks, accelerate month-end close, and enable accounting leaders like you to provide faster insights that will help your company grow. If you're battling messy transaction data from Stripe, Adyen, Shopify, Apple Pay, and other PSPs, and then battling again to get it all into NetSuite, go to leapfin.com to watch their short product intro video. And if you like what you see, request a 15-minute conversation to learn how accounting automation can help you and your team. Check out leapfin.com today. That's leap like jump, fin like shark. I just made that up. I hope they're okay with it. Leapfin.com. As a startup CFO, the number one question my friends come to me with is, who do you use for banking? That's right. They don't ask me for my chicken parm recipe, and they don't ask me where I got my dog groomed. I'm the friend they come to for invoicing, credit card, and bank account advice. Go figure. So I thought I'd just come out and answer it for everybody on the podcast. I recently made the switch to Mercury because I was losing my mind trying to get a clear understanding of how cash entered and left the building. Financial operations were getting needlessly complex, and that's coming from someone who does finance stuff for a living. You can't manage what you can't measure, so I made the change. Plus, it took me literally under 10 minutes to go from application to approval. I'm not kidding. It was wild. Mercury simplifies your financial operations with powerful banking, and it gives you greater control, precision, and speed so you can operate at your best. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by the Choice Financial Group and Evolved Banking Trust. Members FDIC. GS, you'd mentioned earlier instant settlement and instant pay. Why does it take so long? Like you said, in some corridors, it may take up to 4 days to send money and it's too late for an emergency or whatever your need is. For InstaPay, is someone basically like buying money from that's already sitting somewhere else in essence? And that may be a ridiculous way to describe it, but is it that it's more expensive
No.
because they're taking on risk?
I mean, there are two things, right? One is
Yeah.
expense and the timing. The time it takes a lot longer for money transfers on certain corridors through the traditional banking system
Yeah.
because it has to go through the correspondent banking network. So the correspondent banks are a few banks, large banks internationally. So it goes sort of back and forth. You deal with bank A, it goes from bank A to correspondent bank B.
Mm-hmm.
Correspondent bank B then transacts with the correspondent bank C in the destination country. This is a fairly long route.
Yeah.
What happens if the money is already made available there? I just issue I mean, I'm just
Yeah.
metaphorically speaking, I issue a check and issue a check to you in the destination market the moment you need the money. That's what I'm essentially doing, right? I'm only doing it electronically. I'm telling my partner, my receive partner in a receiving corridor that please debit my account and give a credit to an individual customer.
Got it.
It is just an instruction. It's at internet speed, right? So that's the big advantage.
It's an instruction at internet speed versus physically having to move it from A to B to C.
Yeah, I don't think it's a physical moment in as much as a debit and a credit debit.
Right.
It's sort of, you know how it works through the Nostro and the Vostro accounts. It takes time to sort of work its way through the banking system. And therefore, I think that is the inefficiency that we seek to address as a company.
What I do want to ask you about next, though, is how currency or FX margins play a part in your business model or just the ecosystem at large. Because you mentioned before there isn't much transparency there. What I never know is like, are the FX rates actually changing, or is it just somebody's grabbing a larger margin off of it?
No, actually, it is a daily negotiation between us and our send partners. So, obviously, we are dealing with large players and they want very fine spreads over the screen rates. To be fair, we are not the only player in the market. There are several players like us who are competing for the same business. And in fact, the large players do keep options. They don't want to be dependent because this is such a critical transaction. So they would keep 1+1 rail into each country.
Yeah.
So there is always a negotiation that goes. In the past, foreign currency spreads were playing a major role, but I do see that as becoming less and less important, and the companies like us being driven more by transaction fees rather than foreign currency spreads.
Okay.
Spreads won't disappear, they will thin. That's all. So
They'll
there
thin.
was a time when, maybe 40, 50, 60% used to come out of spreads and the balance used to come out of transaction fees. I think it'll, over a period of time, it will flip because this is a very transparent market. There is a screen rate and it's available to everybody, and therefore everybody will negotiate that down.
Yeah. So then they have to make their VIG somewhere else in the transaction. You actually set me up for my next question. And after this, we can move on to some questions about CFOs more in general. But what do you think are the key trends shaping cross-border payments within the next 5 years if somebody's listening?
So one is while we were talking a lot about migrant flows, there is also a huge business for small and medium businesses, right? Who are
Okay.
also dependent on these pipes. So I believe that small and medium businesses will come to rely more and more on these rails over a period of time. They have traditionally relied upon banks, and that could change over a period of time. It's already changing. In fact, probably about, I mean, these the volumes is probably running to 20-25 trillion dollars a year, and a big proportion of that will start moving to non-banking rails for more efficient and quicker settlement, because again it's a cost issue for them. They don't send millions of dollars, they send probably $10,000 at a time, and even at that ticket size, the fees that a bank charges can be punishing. There are a proliferation of small and medium businesses worldwide. countries like India, China, Vietnam, the who small and medium businesses which deal in small ticket or medium ticket transactions. I think that is a very, very huge opportunity, and already there are several players addressing that market. So that would be
Yeah.
opportunity for growth over time. The migrant flows will continue to grow. I mean, they may not grow as fast as they used to in the past, but I would say between 4, 5, 6% is a steady state growth that we will see over time. I also see that the wallet universe will grow dramatically. So many of these cross-border flows, probably 50% of them could end up in wallets, and that is a fantastic opportunity. And we will definitely address that because we are one of the largest players into that market. So wallets will become more and more popular way of receiving money and spending it. That is the way I believe that the industry will evolve. Rails which address each of those opportunities without losing sight. One can argue that just the small and medium business opportunity alone is good enough because
Yeah.
this is under a trillion. The small and medium size is probably 20-25 trillion. So there is
Yeah.
no comparison. Having said that, both opportunities are equally good. I think the spreads in the migrant flows will be better. I'm not sure, but probably will be better. And therefore, these are the three possible directions which companies like us will address. All of them use the same rails, so it's not as if I'm using a different infrastructure to fulfill those transactions.
Okay. All right.
So I'm using the same rails to deliver those transactions. The advantage is are your rails built for scalability? Today I'm doing 100,000. Can I do 300,000? Can I do 500,000 without any failure? That is the key part. So the good news is that a lot of these platforms are built on the cloud, and therefore scalability is not an issue anymore.
That was a great deep dive on the payments ecosystem and where it stands today. I want to talk about the CFO as the Chief Value Creation Officer. That was a term that you threw at me. I'm hoping you could unpack the meaning of that for us.
It's a fairly straightforward thing, right? Because amongst all the CXOs, I think, and this is probably going to sound a bit arrogant, the one person who has an end to end view of the organization is the CFO. And here I can sort of go out on a limb and say even the CEO is not as well informed because typically a CEO could have a marketing point of view or a sales point of view, whereas the CFO has an end-to-end view from the time a raw material gets into the factory till the time it gets out, and the velocity at which you handle that conversion of it into a saleable good. And therefore, no CXO has the level of visibility that a CFO has got on the business. And at the end of the day, it is all about the numbers. And again, the numbers are handled by the CFO. There are two obvious mechanisms by which he gets that visibility. He prepares the budgets every year. So he's the person who leads that process. And he participates deeply in the strategy process. So, just to sort of mix one question, which will probably come at a later stage, why are we suited to create values? Because we are one of the few people who have the opportunity to blend strategy with numbers.
Mm.
I don't think any other function in an organization has a simultaneous view of the business strategy and the numbers that underpin that business strategy. Therefore, I believe that value creation is not just an opportunity, it's actually a responsibility of the CFO. Bloomberg has this very, very popular program called Chief Future Officer. I
Yeah.
think that's not the thing. It's the Chief Value Creation Officer, which is the role that we play.
Well, first of all, I'm stealing that term. I might give you credit because it's awesome. Second of all, was this the case 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or do you think it's evolved to put even more responsibility for creating value in the CFO's hands?
I think two or three things have played a role in that evolution, right? I'm now speaking from an India point of view because a lot of my experience is in India.
Sure.
Most of us came from a very traditional accounting background. I also come from a very traditional accounting background.
Hmm.
So it was more, although we never even used to call ourselves CFOs till the mid 90s. So we used to be senior vice president finance or something like that. I think that we therefore dominantly wore the accounting hat more than anything else. So it
Yeah.
was more a controllership type of posture that we took inside the organization. And the controllership posture is, what can you not do, is easier to answer than what can you do. Now, the transition from what you cannot do and what you can do is a sort of a different, difficult transition to make. And that transition has only been made in the last decade or so. Because if you want to be a chief value creation officer, or if you want to look at strategy, you have to look at what you can do with the resources in your hands rather than what you do not want to do with those resources. So I think it's a question of perspective. And that evolution internationally, I think in the US and the Western countries, it probably has happened a bit earlier. But in India, it has, in most of the other countries, it has happened over the course of the last decade. And that has been largely driven by the fact that the CFO is the person who communicates to the market, to the investors. And he has to talk strategy when he communicates with the investors. If he has to talk strategy, he has to understand strategy. So I think with the public markets playing a greater and greater role, the CFO has been compelled to evolve into wearing the strategy hat along with the CEO.
And even when you say the word controller or controllership, control implies like a stop sign. It implies taking something and that's in motion and like pausing to inspect it or to say
Yeah.
no. Driving value to me feels like a green light. To your point, it's what you can do and it's what you actually should do if I've allocated resources to you.
Yeah.
Are there any pillars involved in creating value from your perspective?
My own view is to be a successful value creator in any organization, I think you must first know where you stand, the baseline. And you can either establish the baseline in a formal manner, you can engage consultants to establish your baseline, or you can depend on the way the market is valuing you. If you're a listed entity, obviously you can arrive at a valuation quite easily. The third possibility is that you actually engage consultants to do a valuation of the company. And all this, the robustness of that process is a function of the robustness of your planning process. How robust is your business plan? How well are the assumptions articulated? How well are the sensitivities played out in the business model? That would determine whether you have the right base to do a valuation. The
Mm,
second thing I think is you must understand what are the multiples that drive this valuation. So, depending on the maturity of the organization, is it revenue or is it EBITDA, whatever it is, and have a very, very realistic and conservative understanding of those multiples. It's not you're not here trying to sell the company. You're trying to discover the intrinsic worth of the asset that you're managing, and therefore a very conservative outlook on that. That would be the first step that you take in the value driving process. The second step or pillar is understanding what are the value drivers. Now, this may be a very simple thing these days to ask, but I suspect that many of us still struggle to identify the value driver. Our instinctive, response to that is, my value is driven by sales or profitability. Yeah, those are the obvious things. But what are
right.
the underlying value drivers that drive those numbers? Just as an illustration, if I were a retail company, large retail company, I would assume that what drives value is how quickly you can build out stores, because there is a revenue metric that you can achieve per square feet. If
Hmm.
I can efficiently build out stores, then I can build value. So, what is the cost at which I build per square feet, and how much revenue I can extract from each square feet? I mean, I'm not saying that is the right or the wrong thing. Each company has its own unique, proposition. You take the mobile phone company, at least in the early days. Today, of course, mobile telephony companies, the per minute cost has dropped to a very, very low number. But when it was an expensive service for the individuals, one could have argued that revenue ARPU is a very popular way of
Yeah,
measuring
average
it.
revenue per user.
What drives ARPU is a question, right? So, what drives ARPU is what are the type of investments you're making in the network? How are you retaining your customers? What is the customer churn? All these blend together to drive ARPU, which in turn drives revenue per customer, which in turn drives the customer's lifetime value. The sum of which is really the value of the company, the sigma of which is the. Now, why is churn important? I mean, it's so expensive to acquire customers these days, and if you lose a customer within the first 3-4 months, that is a valuable investment which has gone down the tubes. So the value drivers for each industry would be unique to that industry, and therefore the CFO has to understand what are the elements which drive that value, and that comes from a deep understanding of the industry that the CFO is in. This is where the longevity of a CFO in an industry is very critical, because if you have CFOs spending even I have made that mistake, but I believe that you need to spend at least 2 to 3 years to really deeply understand an industry, and that depth of understanding is what helps you identify the drivers that create value, and so that's probably the next step in the process. The third step would be to communicate that value, because
Hmm.
you need to not only communicate it to potential investors, because that is the storytelling part of it. These are my numbers, and this is the story behind those numbers. But that storytelling has also to happen within the organization, because even your own colleagues may not discern the company in terms of those value drivers. So you have to be able to convincingly tell your colleagues that these are the value drivers that we have to measure. We have to put a metric behind each of these value drivers, because the sum of these value drivers is what drives the value of an organization. That is also a skill set that comes to CFOs more easily when they are public companies. I mean, because they're constantly communicating with analysts who actually give you good guidance on how to tell the story, and then you can bring it back within the organization and actually tell this is the expectation of the markets. This is how we should consider measuring the performance of the company in these value driver areas.
What I love about that description is you took it further than just sales and revenue. You broke it down to the atomic units that are driving revenue. And it sounded like you could assign out what metrics underneath that drove it.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Just as an example, this is an obvious choice, but because if you go to anybody in the mobile telephony space, they're going to tell you the same thing. But churn percentage is closely tracked by these companies for that very reason, right? Because
Mm.
the cost of acquisition is so high. If you lose a customer, you lose a chunk of investment that you've made in the customer. So that is tracked very, very closely. So that was an obvious example. There are non-obvious examples like, let us say, a manufacturing company. How quickly is it able to turn raw material into a finished product can be a key value driver for that company. Now, that is not an obvious thing that the CFO tracks when he looks at the financial numbers. But if I'm able to measure the time it takes from raw material to finished goods, and if I'm able to play a role in compressing that, for example, that's a value creator. Just in time is a value creator, right? The Japanese have demonstrated it time and again. So I think it is industry specific and situation specific. And it sometimes can be also company maturity specific.
Say more about that.
So, for example, if I'm a startup company, I may look at only the metrics which drive the top line. Whatever the value drivers relating to that would be important to me. So, for example, uh, what is the market share that I have of a particular sector could be very critical, because when I'm telling the story to my potential investors, I'm talking market share and saying that I'm going after this market share, and the investment that I'm making today is to go after that market share. Because that market share may not result in bottom line today, but it results in a potential cash flow stream going forward, which is again an obvious thing. Each of these large corporates, when they initially told their story, would have told the story that way. So that is the early stage company. But when you come to a maturity phase, I'm sure Google looks at not just market share, because it already has a dominant market share, but how can it produce those services at the most efficient price possible. So if I'm having a server farm in the United States, how can I place server farms closer to their use in a country like India? So, I'm not very familiar with that industry, but I'm very sure the sheer size of these investments that they make drives down costs and gives them the ability to negotiate costs to the nth degree, and therefore pass on those competitive advantages to their customers and further grow their share of market.
Got it. Three things I just want to call out for the listeners because that was wonderful. And the first thing is the process itself is not always straightforward in identifying these. Second thing is it's not always a financial metric that's coming out of it. It's often process oriented and throughput oriented. And the third thing is it's only worth it if you can communicate it, right? Because you're not going to be able to change it and you're not going to be able to communicate the underlying value of why you want to change that metric. So I just want to say that was an amazing explanation.
Yeah.
GS, one more question before we move on. What qualities do you think separate the good CFOs from the great CFOs?
Again, fairly obvious, deep understanding of the business. Very, very deep understanding of the business is one very important quality. When a CFO explains the business model of his industry to anybody, he should be able to articulate it well and articulate it in a very simple fashion. That's the first thing. Because without that deep understanding, I don't think any CFO anywhere can be effective. Good communication skills. I think, again, because in many countries we are trained purely as accountants, communication skills do not come readily to us. You have to consciously develop those skills. So I think communication skills is a second important quality, because at every point of time you're either communicating internally to your stakeholders or externally to the external stakeholders, and that's a very important role for the CFO to play. And the ability to manage costs in organizations still remains the remit of the CFO. Because one thing that is certain is costs. Revenues, there is a degree of uncertainty attached to it. So a CFO is very passionately involved in the development of the cost structure, and management of that cost structure is always going to be a successful CFO. He should be able to play scenarios well. So, what if this does not happen? How do I manage the situation? So, watertight look on cash flows at all time. I think these are the general qualities I think that would differentiate CFO from a good CFO.
Well said. I'm going to take you into what we call our long ass lightning round. So you're a successful guy, but you got to give me one thing that you've messed up in your career. Could be this job or a different one.
I did have an episode in my life or career when I went into a board meeting with the consolidated results of a company and then realized that there was a big error in the consolidation.
Oh, no.
That cost me a lot of embarrassment. I had a lot of explanation to do. So at the end of the day, the can rolls up to the CFO. So I had to take the can for that. That was probably one of my most mortifying moments.
Yeah, I feel for you there. That's a visceral reaction of knowing, walking in like, oh man, I know that number's wrong.
Yeah.
If you could tell your younger self something knowing what you know today, what would you tell him?
I do tend to be a bit negative when I look at issues. I have tended to be, in fact, I have tended to be too much of a controller in my earlier earlier past. I've
Mm-hmm.
evolved into a CFO only in the recent couple of decades. Luckily for me, because I worked in public companies, and that compelled me to communicate with investors and analysts, and that forced me to learn that communication skill. If I were to tell my younger self, I would I would say, how do you communicate numbers? That is the key skill set that you need to develop if you have to be a successful CFO.
What struck me about that is you hit on the tone of how you communicated first. You said negative. And, a question in retrospect I wish I've asked the 100 or so CFOs that I've interviewed so far is, are you a glass half full or glass half empty person? I I wonder what the results would be if I pulled them all.
I think most CFOs would be glad. They will at least articulate half full rather than half empty, because everybody likes to portray positivity, but personalities differ, right? And deep down, whether your glass half full or half empty can depend on. If you're a controller mindset, it'll always be half empty. So that is something, CFOs play a very, very big role in critical times. So there will be crises. And how you handle that crisis and how you develop confidence amongst your colleagues to develop a solution oriented mindset is very, very important. And that positive mindset is an important ingredient of that solution orientation.
Yeah, because there is a bit of risk versus optimism, and if that's the same thing as positivity versus negativity, but I think it's more nuanced than that.
It's more nuanced, and is more, are you a solution oriented person rather than, if you're a solution oriented person, every crisis, I'm sure, has a solution.
You hit the nail on the head there. It's, as a CFO, it's not if your glass half full or half empty. It's, I can fill the glass back up because I'm solution oriented here if it's emptied out.
Yeah.
More technical question. Can you walk me through your finance software stack? What tools does your team use to get the job done?
Obviously, we use an ERP system, which is NetSuite. That's the most suitable for a very, very cloud-based company. And NetSuite was originally, even it is a cloud-based solution.
Yeah.
We use Chrome River. We have implemented Chrome River for expense management.
Okay.
We have our own systems for bill processing, which is not developed internally, but in collaboration with the software firm in Bangalore. So bill processing and payments and integration into the banking system. So we are seamlessly integrated into the banking system so that it can trigger payments automatically on due date. Planning and budgeting, we use a solution called Abacum, which we have just migrated to recently. I've yet to see whether it's a good or a bad decision. My team came and recommended it. I have gone with the team's recommendation. But any new tool has its own learning curve issues. So we are in the process of doing that. We are a very high velocity transaction institution. So reconciliation is a big part of our life. So we use a automated reconciliation solution. It's called Smart Recon, and that's the other solution that we use. These are the broad stacks that we work with. No rocket science at this point of time. We have a data analytics solution, which is not coming under the finance function per se, but it reports a lot of the finance numbers. So we have a data analytics team which develops those solutions. We are fairly forward in that forward stance in data analytics, given the nature of our business.
Yeah.
We generate a hell of a lot of data every day. So that helps us
I imagine.
plan liquidity by corridor and all that stuff. So it's a pretty sophisticated system.
Are you using anything like a Tableau or a Sigma there? What are you using?
We use a very, very high-end data analytics platform called, I think it is called Scribble Data. You may not have heard of it. It's a small company based out of India, but they do some very, very high, heavy-duty data analytics for us.
Yeah, I'd imagine you're capturing more data than you know what to do with all the transactions.
Absolutely. In fact, Tableau and all would not cut it for us.
Got it. That was amazing. Last question I got for you. What's the craziest thing you've ever had someone try to expense?
Nothing spectacular, actually. Somebody went for dinner with his wife and claimed it as his official expenses. So, nothing spectacular.
Took the old lady out to Red Lobster. Caught again. Okay. Well,
I wish it was just Red Lobster. It was a much more expensive restaurant. That was a problem.
GS, you're extremely thoughtful. I've had a blast talking to you, and you've made me a lot smarter about the payments industry. So I got to thank you for coming on. Run the Numbers is a mostly LLC production. Yelling an intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by some AI thingamajig. Podcast and video editing is done by Cleancast at cleancast.io. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses, LOL. If you like this podcast, please hit subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And also check out mostlymetrics.com. That's my newsletter where I explore business models and financial metrics. Thanks for riding with me. Share this with your friends. Peace.